calipers. They're called calipers, and I could not for the life of me remember that word. Hey crafters, it's Amanda. I am so glad you are here. Today I am going to go through all of my crochet hooks and I'm going to test them with the calipers and see how accurate the listed size on them is. So I've got my calipers, I've got my hooks, let's get measuring. It probably helps if it has the battery in it. So let's start off with a big hook. This is supposed to be a 30 millimeter, and I'm of course gonna measure the thick part. So this is a tapered hook, so I'm not gonna measure the taper part because that will obviously be thinner, but this part here should be 30 millimeters. Okay, that's not too bad, 29.92. Let's go with something a little smaller, like a 5 millimeter hook. Again, I'm not going to the taper spot, I'm going to the throat of the hook. 4.94, that's pretty good, I'll take it. What I really want to see though is some of these smaller ones, because when you're working with the smaller hook, you're probably working with smaller thread, and being off by a 0.5 millimeter can really make a difference. So let's see what this one reads at. 2.88. It's marked as 3.25 millimeter. Are you kidding me? This is so validating. I'm gonna have to start taking notes on this, and I'm gonna make a whole chart and log this and then give y'all the math breakdown of like what percentage it's off by. Time for data collection. Let's go. All right, I need to come up with a methodical way to do this because I have so many different kinds of hooks. I think I'm gonna sort them out by brand and then go big size down to small size. So let me get these sorted out. My chart is ready. Let's measure some boy hooks. Do we think it's gonna measure 9 millimeter? Let's see. Wow, this is spot on 8 millimeter. Wow. And that clearly says 9. Are we gonna get 6.5 millimeter? Let's see. All right, I feel like 6.81's not bad. 6.43. These are supposed to be the same size hook, but I had an almost 0.4 millimeter difference. All right, 3.91 when it's supposed to be 4.25. No, I can't, I'm not cool with that. Got the boy hooks measured. So next I'm gonna tackle my Tunisian crochet hooks. These are a little bit pricey, so I'm really interested on what the accuracy of them is. All right, starting off with the 15 millimeter. 13.94. We all will call it 9.4. 12 millimeter. Let's see about the 9 millimeter here. All right, so these didn't do so hot either. These ones weren't terrible. What I do find interesting though is if you compare two different hooks by the same brand, same size, this isn't terrible. These are pretty close to each other. Pretty close to each other. This is a little more off. Again, we'll do a full analysis later on. Now let's tackle the We Crochet Dots hooks. This is supposed to be a 6 millimeter. Ooh, we're pretty good at that one. I get really excited when they're close. All right, 5.5. Oh my goodness, we are gonna have a clear winner here. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. Wow, this is a 5 millimeter. Okay, everybody go buy these hooks. I'm not like sponsored by them or affiliated with them, but let's see, 4.59, 4.5. Right off the bat, these ones have set themselves apart. Oh, look at how beautiful that is. Next up, I have 4 Susan Bates hooks. These 3 are steel hooks for thread crochet. So they just have a number, not an actual measurement. This one doesn't have a measurement either, so we're not gonna be able to do analysis on accuracy, but I am curious to see what the actual measurement is on these. I kind of wish I had some Susan Bates hooks that had the listed size. I prefer tapered hooks over inline hooks, so I don't work with Susan Bates hooks that often, but they are another big brand, so I wish that I actually had some hooks to better include them in my analysis. The last actual brand of hooks is Hobby Lobby, and I don't know that these are even necessarily the same brand. They're just whatever Hobby Lobby carries. Now for an 8 millimeter. This is a wooden hook. Oh, that's not bad either. Hobby Lobby coming through. I honestly have lower expectations on these just because, you know, they're just kind of, I say, generic hooks. All right, this one is a little bit tricky. It's tapered like all the way through here, so I guess this section up here is what I need to measure. Okay, that's 2.64 when I measure up there. It's supposed to be 1.5. Wow, nowhere does this hook get down to 1.5. Oh my gosh. Okay, it goes down to, well, it doesn't really even there. It gets down to like 1.5 if I'm at this very like the tapered section, but I don't think that's where you measure them. So let's take this section right here, 1.86. I'm gonna put a question mark next to that one. So I've collected all my data. Let me go put this into a spreadsheet and we'll see how things ended up. My spreadsheet of hook data is built. I've started doing some analyses, but what I did to start off with is I entered my data into the Excel spreadsheet. That data includes, first of all, the brand. The description is just for my own benefit, so if I ever go back and look at my hooks, I know which one I'm talking about. Then I have the listed size. This is the number that is printed on the hook itself. The measured size, of course, is the size that I measured using the calipers. So those first 4 columns is the data that I collected when I was up in the workshop barn and measuring and compiling all these things. If we look down towards the bottom though, we have a lot of hooks that did not have a listed size on them, meaning they didn't tell you how many millimeters they were. So I sorted these to the bottom for my data page just to make the formulas for calculations a little easier later on. So this is my first data set. We're not going to talk about the math yet, but this is my first data set. This first tab, I'm calling it data. Then I have a second tab that I'm calling speculative data. Basically, it's my data, but then I went through and filled in potential values. So for instance, if we look at the Susan Bates hook, that is a size K, that did not have any listed measurement on it. So to come up with a speculative value for what it might supposed to be, I looked up online what size Susan Bates advertises its size K hooks to be. And that's how I came up with the 6.5 millimeter. Basically, the speculative data is I'm filling in the gaps with my best guesses. Those best guesses I'm coming up with by looking up what size the brands currently sell those hooks at. I also removed some of the data from the table. First of all, anything that had zero indication of what size it was even supposed to be, I just removed those completely because there's no way I can fill in speculative data on those. Secondly, on my speculative data page, it's still on here, but from my calculations, I removed those 2 really small Hobby Lobby hooks because, again, it was really questionable if I was measuring the correct spot on the hook or not. So for the speculative data, I'm essentially trying to remove the outliers. That's what the 2 pages are, and then I did the same set of calculations on both pages. So if we go back to the first sheet, I first of all wanted to find the quantitative difference between the listed size and the measured size. If you're not a nerdy numbers person like myself, all that means is what's the measured difference? So for instance, if we look at this first plastic boy hook, it's listed as 30 millimeters, but the measured size is 29.85. So it's what is the distance? What is the difference between those? And in this case, it's negative 0.15. So that means the measurements are off by 0.15 millimeters, and the negative tells us that the actual hook is smaller than the size that it's listed as. I went through and did that with all the hooks, trying to see if we've got any significant or noteworthy outliers here. I think this one here is funny. Line 11, this boy hook, that's a 9 millimeter or that's supposed to be a 9 millimeter and measured exactly at 8 millimeters. That's a quantitative difference of 1 millimeter. The actual size is 1 millimeter less than it was supposed to be. And so that's gonna bring us to the next column in my data table here. And that is the percent difference. And what I mean by percent difference is instead of looking at the actual value, how much it's off by, we're creating a proportion of what percent off from itself is it. Here's the formula of how I set that up if you are interested in that, or if you want to build your own kind of table like this. And here's why it can be helpful to look at things as a percentage difference and not just the quantitative difference. If we compare this first entry here, the quantitative difference, meaning the amount the measurement is off by, is 0.15. Because the hook is such a large size, 30 millimeters, if it's supposed to be 30 millimeters, but it's only off by 0.15 millimeters, the percent difference is only half of a percent difference. Essentially saying that 0.15 millimeters is not that big a deal to be off if you're looking at something that's 30 millimeters. But then we can come down here to this Denise hook. This one's off by about the same amount. It's off by 0.16. However, the hook size that we're looking at is an 8 millimeter. 8 millimeters is significantly smaller than 30 millimeters. So when we come over here and look at the percent difference,
even though these two hooks are off by about the same quantitative difference, the percent difference they're off by is very different. This one is off by 2%. So the percent difference is just another way for us to look at the data and kind of get a sense of how accurate or not it is. As another note, I went ahead and calculated the percent differences all as positive numbers, like I just took the absolute value. The quantitative difference, I left it in indicating whether it was greater or larger than it was supposed to be. But for the percent differences, I just made it all a positive number. So for this one where it says it's 7% difference, that means the measured size is 7% different than the size it's supposed to be. It could be 7% bigger, it could be 7% less. The reason I set it up this way is so that way I can do an analysis to see on average what percent a hook brand is off by. If I'd kept them positive and negative, what could have happened is, let's say that most of the time the boy hooks are off by, say, 10%. Well, if there's the same amount that are 10% positive and 10% negative, when I take the average, it's going to say that, oh, they're 0% off, when really on average, the amount that it's off by would actually be 10%. Again, I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. If this is over your head, that's okay. We're going to get into more what of this actually means in a little bit. I'm just having fun geeking out over the data. So then the last main thing I did with my table of data is I wanted to see how many hooks were off by less than 0.25 millimeters. A lot of hook sizes change by a ½ millimeter difference. As you get to smaller hooks, some of them can change by 0.25 millimeters, but generally speaking, you're going to have a 2 millimeter, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5, etc. So I figured if something was within 0.25 millimeters of its supposed to be size, I felt like that's pretty decently in range. So this column here calculates whether or not the quantitative difference of the hook size, the measured size compared to the listed size, was within that 0.25 millimeters of accuracy. If the difference is less than 0.25 millimeters, it gets a yes. If it's more than 0.25 millimeters, then no, it's not within that range of accuracy. Those 3 extra columns are the same on the speculative data. So same spreadsheet essentially, just 2 different data sets. So this portion of the chart is really interesting because this gives me data on a hook by hook basis. And quite honestly, I kind of want to flag some of my hooks and be like, if you're looking for a 4.5 millimeter hook, don't go with that one, go with this one because this one's more accurate. Maybe I will, probably I won't. But in Fantasyland, it'd be great if I did that. So it is helpful because it lets me know some of my hooks are very far off. For instance, my 9 millimeter hook that actually measures 8 millimeters. Yeah, I've kind of wondered about that for a while. And there's some other ones in here, like I have a boy hook that's off by 8%, a boy hook that's off by 10%, a boy hook that's off by 22.67%. So this one is interesting because the hook size is supposed to be 2.25 millimeters, but when it was measured, it was actually 2.76 millimeters. So the quantitative difference is 0.51 meters, so it's only about ½ a millimeter off. I think I just said meters, not millimeters. Obviously, I didn't mean to say meters there. So while it's only ½ a millimeter off, when the hook size is only supposed to be 2.25 millimeters, ½ a millimeter is a big deal. That ½ millimeter also means that it's outside that 0.25 millimeter range, so we're pretty much in a completely different hook size territory than it's supposed to be. And then if we look at the percent difference, it's 22.67% off. Yeah, that's kind of bad from a percentage perspective. That's over 1/5 of the way inaccurate. 2 other things is I have those Hobby Lobby ones I kind of already mentioned. Those have the biggest percent differences, 24% and 46.67%. I left them in for my factual data, but I feel like that data is a little bit speculative too and a little bit iffy because again, I'm not sure if I measured on the correct part of the hook. So with all of that data, I was then able to do an analysis across the different brands. And here's what we ended up with across the brands. In first place is the We Crochet dots. Those ones are accurate within a 1.12% range, meaning on average, they're about 1% off, which honestly, 1% off, no big deal. The biggest offender is the Hobby Lobby ones, but again, that has those 2 kind of funky outliers, so that's probably a bit of an exaggeration. I was surprised with my Denise hooks. I honestly would have expected the Denise hooks to be more accurate. And while I did have several that were right on the money, there were enough outliers that were outliers by a significant enough that it did kind of shift the accuracy of the brand as a whole. And then boy, oh my gosh, listen, I love boy hooks. They've what I've been crocheting with since day one. I still continue to use them, still love them. but I have known for a while that there's some issues with their sizing, and this only confirmed that. So they were off by almost 6%. I had a few other random brands that I was actually able to identify, and those ones were only 1.3% off on average. And if we look at everything on the whole, my hooks are on average about 4.5% off. However, it's important to remember how averages work. Because remember, an average is a way to look at a set of numbers and kind of figure out about where's the middle. So kind of the middle of the range is 4.66%. But it only takes a few hooks that are way off to shift things around. So while it does give us an overview of these different brands, there is still the aspect of it can vary hook by hook. Also, this last thing here where I talk about level of acceptance, for me, I'm calling if it's within a 0.25 millimeter range, I'm calling that an acceptable level of difference. So I just found out across all the hooks what percentage were within that acceptable level that I kind of arbitrarily decided on. And almost 70% of hooks are within the acceptable range. So now same thing on my speculative data chart. Again, this is one where I made logical and educated guesses to fill in some of the blanks in the data, removed some of those hooks that there was no way I could tell what they were, and I also removed those 2 Hobby Lobby outliers. And when we do that, boy performs even worse. I call this column accuracy. Really, it's the level of inaccuracy, but the amount it's off by goes up to 7.44%. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not ideal by any means. And if we look at the level of acceptance, only a little over half of the hooks are within that 0.25 millimeter difference, which I think is kind of bad. Same with my Denise hooks. I was really surprised with this one, and I still love those hooks. But they are a little more expensive, so you kind of think a little higher level of quality. And while the quality of the product itself is great, the quality of the accuracy of measurements clearly has some room for improvement. Hobby Lobby over here looks really good, but keep in mind that's only a 2-hook data set. But if we look at the We Crochet Dots hooks, those ones have a 100% level of acceptance, meaning no hook is off by 2.5 millimeters or more. And the average accuracy is within just over 1%. I think that's pretty darn awesome. They were pretty much all right on the money. Susan Bates also looks really off, but I had to fill in all the data for that. And with my speculative data research, I had a hard time finding out what they advertise or aim to be. So when I went about filling in my speculative data, my method was to look up the brand and see what they advertise the millimeter size to be for that hook. I'll use a size G boy hook. Boy currently sells multiple size G hooks in different packets. Some are aluminum, some are plastic. And their size G aluminum hooks are listed as 4.25, while their size G plastic hooks are listed as 4 millimeter. Now sure, it's only off by 0.25 millimeters, but that's not the first time I've encountered a brand selling hooks that they give the same letter size to, but then completely different millimeter sizes to. Another thing I have seen with Boy is they have changed the designated millimeter of certain hook sizes. When I first started buying crochet hooks, I bought a Boy size J crochet hook, and it was advertised on the package as being a 6 millimeter hook. However, when I look up Boy size J hooks now, it's now listed as 5.75 millimeters. So assuming that the listed size is accurate, Boy, for whatever reason, over the years changed the sizing of what they call a J hook. I've seen this multiple times with Boy, and a large part of it is that's a brand I very frequently use and am familiar with. I have seen it, not quite as often, but I have seen the same phenomenon with Susan Bates hooks. And I think part of the reason why I haven't seen it quite as much is because I just don't use Susan Bates hooks too often. So within a brand, they over time may change the millimeter that goes with the hook name. Then to further complicate things is different brands will use the same names but assign them different millimeters. For instance, if we take a look at some steel crochet hooks, Boy advertises that their steel hook size 0 is 3.25 millimeters. Meanwhile, the Susan Bates steel hook size 0 is advertised as 2.25 millimeters. So they're both calling them size 1 steel hooks, but they're off by a full millimeter. And when you're only talking about 2 to 3 millimeters, that 1 millimeter is about a 30 to 50% difference, so it's fairly significant. And then even if you set aside the issue of the naming conventions, where a company uses the same name to over time refer to different millimeter sizes, and where different companies use the same name to refer to different millimeter sizes, you also have, as I found through this analysis, that the actual size of the hook might not even match with the advertised size of the hook. So when the data was showing me that hook sizes are kind of very ambiguous, it made me start questioning why. Because in my mind, you have, generally speaking, plastic hooks, aluminum hooks, and steel hooks. If you're making a plastic hook, I would envision you to have some kind of a mold, some kind of a die, you do like a plastic mold cast thing. Okay, some of y'all are gonna know what I'm talking about, not all of y'all. But back in the day, this was like, I was like the very last of like kids to get to use these. You'd go to like the zoo or an amusement park and they would have the, not a vending machine, but they'd have the machine where you put the coins in it and it makes the plastic toy where it like, I say it inflates it. I cannot think of what they're called. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. Anyways, I've always thought that process was really cool, and I kind of assumed that that's probably a similar way that plastic crochet hooks are made, right? So you would think it would always be accurate to the mold. Same with the aluminum hooks. I started thinking to myself, surely there's some kind of mold that they create and then all the hooks are cast in this mold, so you think it would be accurate. But then I thought to myself, well, maybe that's not how hooks are made. Maybe there is a lot more ambiguity and quality control can be a lot harder. So then I started researching how are crochet hooks made, and y'all, I had a really hard time finding any information on it. But what I did find, I honestly think is kind of cooler. Namely, I came across a patent for method of and apparatus for manufacturing crochet needles. I kind of bristled a little bit at it being called a crochet needle, but then when you read through it, it's described as making needles used for performing operations of needles with hook or barb. For example, crochet hook. So I'm like, okay, I can kind of see from a production side of things, calling it a needle. I might need to issue some apologies for telling people that no, crochet doesn't use needles. But there's a patent for the way that the hook is produced. I do not understand the schematics of this patent. So then I kept kind of searching to see if I could find more on this, and the inventor of the aforementioned hook manufacturing patent machine thing is Gustav A. Carlson, and he also made a can opener design. So I'll link all these in the description down below, but I came across this really cool article thing talking about how Gustav Carlson worked for Boy Needle Company. And apparently, Boy Needle Company also made some can openers. So in my mind, I always think of Boy as being crochet, but if you think about it, the metal can opener they show is a similar type product where you have some kind of metal that needs to be shaped, and they're basically doing machining with metals and aluminums and things like that. So that was really cool, but again, it did not answer my question of what is the actual manufacturing of crochet hooks that leads to this inaccuracy. So I kept searching more. Then I next came across the invention of inline hooks. Fascinating stuff. The application was filed on November 1st, 1949. And this is where I finally found my best guess about how crochet hooks are made, or at least were made at some point in history. All right, here we go. I found the part. So according to the improved method, the steel shaft, which is to be employed in manufacturing the needle and suitably swaged in a swaging machine to give it the desired taper at one end. I don't know what a swaging machine is. The tapered end is then stamped in a set of dies, which produces the hook. And this is talking about how it used to be made, and then I think he's going to talk about how to make it better, or something like that. Either way, it talks about there being stamped in a set of dies, which should mean consistent accuracy. So how then do companies produce hooks that are so far off in size? And I think what it comes down to is probably mostly a lack of caring and a lack of quality control. I want to be really clear, I am not at all making any accusations that any of these companies are intentionally mislabeling their projects or willfully going, you know what, we're going to slap a millimeter number on there and knowingly and intentionally deceive customers and not make it very accurate. I don't think that's what's likely going on. I think it most likely comes down to, no one really checking up on things. I mean, when was the last time you got a calipers out to measure your hooks? I mean, this was the first time for me, right? Otherwise, I would just kind of assume that, yeah, if it says it's a 4.5 millimeter hook, then surely it's a 4.5 millimeter hook. My data set shows that for my hooks at least, that's not always the case. So where then does this leave us as crocheters? Here are my thoughts. First of all, I don't actually think it's the end of the world if hook sizes are off, even if they're off significantly from their advertised measurement. The reason being is we all already have our own tension anyways, and if you're working on a project where you need to achieve a certain gauge, even if two people use the exact same hook, odds are just due to individuals' personal tension, they're going to end up a little bit different anyways. So in a scenario where you're supposed to use a certain hook size to achieve a certain result, odds are you may still have to try a different hook size simply because your personal tension might be different than the personal tension of whoever designed the pattern. Secondly, for me, a lot of my projects, when I'm picking out my hook size, I pick it out more intuitively, meaning I know what I want the end result to be, and I've got a pretty good gut sense of if I know how tight or loose I want my fabric to be, I can usually kind of eyeball a hook and be like, that's going to work out well. And of course, if I don't like the way it's turning out, I can start over with a different hook size. But for me personally, generally speaking, there's not a situation where I have to use a certain millimeter size hook. So it doesn't necessarily have that big of an impact. Here's where I think it is an issue though. The first issue is if you are following someone else's pattern and they give you a recommended hook size. The recommended hook size, even if you still have to change it up or down a little bit to get your gauge to match that for the pattern, the recommended hook size at least gives you a good starting point. Same with the recommended hook size on yarn labels. It gives a really solid starting point. And if the recommended starting point doesn't actually correspond to anything meaningful listed on your hook, it's going to be frustrating and you're going to be scratching your head going, why is this not turning out the way I expected it to? The other scenario where this can be a big problem is one that I have run into before, and that's where I start using one hook on a project and then the hook gets misplaced, lost with another project, whatever, and I grab a different hook to complete it. In that scenario, of course, I'm grabbing hooks that are the same size, meaning if I started with a 5mm, I'm ending with a 5mm. But as we've discovered, just because a hook says that it's supposed to be 5mm doesn't mean it actually is. So the hook I started with could actually measure something like 4.3mm, and then the hook that I swap over to might measure 5.7mm. And you end up with a pretty big gap, and it is going to impact your tension and the size of your stitches. I have done that before. So what can you do about it? One is you can get calipers and measure them. I mean, I don't know that I would have invested in a pair of calipers just for that. I was able to use my dad's. But if you have it available, it is kind of interesting going through and compiling and figuring out which of my hooks are right on the money and which ones are kind of sketchy. Another thing too is to be mindful of the brands you buy from. Again, I love boy hooks. They have served me well for a long time. A lot of people don't like them, and it generally is because of quality issues. They are cheap hooks, and they're cheap for a reason. For me, they've served me well, and I enjoy using them. But as you can see, the price point does come with some drawbacks, namely that the sizing might not be accurate at all. I obviously don't have a ton of data on a lot of different brands, because even though I do have a lot of hooks, there's so many brands out there that I've never tried. But from my analysis, I did find that the We Crochet dots are extremely accurate, so I was really thrilled about that. So I would highly recommend the We Crochet dots hooks. The ergonomic handle is super comfortable, glides through yarn nicely, and as we saw today, they're very accurate. Well, anyways, that was a lot of fun, at least for me. I don't know if y'all enjoy that, but I really liked geeking out over the data, and I really find it fascinating. I really wish I could have found like a how it's made episode for crochet hooks. If anybody knows of any footage from a crochet manufacturing company where they show how the hooks are made, please send it my way. I would love to see that. But even if you don't have a resource that I can look at to see how they're made, do drop a comment down below and give me your thought on crochet hooks. Were you surprised by this? Have you encountered this before? Do you have a favorite brand or brand you don't like? I want to hear all your thoughts about crochet hooks. May your stitch counts be accurate and your crochet hook actually be the size it's advertised to be. Happy crafting!